On behalf of the International Drug Policy Consortium, IDPC, Penal Reform International, PRI, and the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, I'd like to welcome you to our side event organized at the margins of the 30th UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice intersessional meeting. My name is Coletta Youngers. I am a senior associate with IDPC, a senior fellow with WOLA, and a member of the PRI Advisory Council. So I suppose that given my connection to all three organizations, it's only fitting that I be your moderator today. The Kyoto Declaration was adopted at the 14th UN Congress on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice held in March 2021. The declaration places a strong emphasis on protecting the rights of women within the criminal legal system, with provisions on improving detention conditions and promoting gender-responsive measures that address the gender-specific needs of women behind bars. Punitive drug laws are one of the key drivers of rising prison populations, particularly for women. Worldwide, over a third of incarcerated women are there for drug-related offenses. This proportion rises to 50 and even 80% in several Latin American and Asian countries. Yet drug policies receive only scant mention in the declaration. This lack of attention underlines the disjointed approach to drugs and criminal justice at the international level. Nonetheless, the Kyoto Declaration does promote proportionality in sentencing, a powerful tool to resist the overuse of imprisonment. During its 30th regular session in May 2021, the CCPCJ adopted a resolution approving the Kyoto Declaration, recommending its endorsement by the General Assembly and requesting intersessional thematic discussions on a work plan to effectively follow up on the Kyoto Declaration and work towards its implementation through the sharing of information, good practices, and lessons learned. The work plan includes, among other things, a thematic focus this year on mainstreaming a gender perspective into crime prevention taking place today. It's 8 a.m. where I am, but I hope others have been able to tune in those discussions at the CCPCJ today. And in 2022, there will be a focus on mainstreaming a gender perspective into criminal justice systems. So today's event will explore the gendered impacts of drug control on the carceral and the carceral system on women's human rights, including the highlighting the urgent need for extensive drug law reforms in order to achieve the stated goals set out in the declaration, as well as other key international instruments, including the UN Bangkok rules adopted almost 11 years ago, as well as other needed reforms. We have 5 terrific speakers today and only 1 hour, so I'm going to go right to our first speaker. I will introduce each person before they speak, and they've been asked to speak for about 8 minutes, and I will indicate when the time is up. We will hopefully have about 10 minutes at the end for a round of questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A. I'm very honored to introduce our first speaker, who will provide introductory remarks, Ambassador Luis Javier Campuzano Piña, who is the Ambassador of Mexico and Austria and permanent representative to the international organizations in Vienna. Ambassador Campuzano Pina entered the Foreign Service in 1989, where he first worked for the General Coordination of Counselors to the Foreign Minister and was personal secretary of the Vice Minister for International Cooperation, as well as technical secretary for the Foreign Minister. From June 2006 to November 2009, he was Deputy Permanent Representative to the Mission of Organization of American States in Washington, D.C. In September 2001, he was promoted to the rank of ambassador. He then served as ambassador of Mexico and Kenya, concurrently accredited to 6 other African countries, and was also permanent representative of Mexico to UNEP and UN Habitat. From June 2014 to May 2017, he was Mexico's ambassador to Norway, after which he was Director General for the UN at the Mexican Foreign Ministry until early December 2018. And then counselor at the Vice Ministry of Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights. In June 2020, he took up his post as ambassador in Vienna, Austria. The Mexican government has played a key role in promoting gender-sensitive drug policies within the United Nations. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me start by expressing my deepest appreciation to the organizers for the invitation to provide these opening remarks and for bringing together member states' representatives, human rights experts, civil society, and community members to discuss the different ways in which criminal justice impacts women, and how we can consider reforming our criminal laws, including our drug laws, to fulfill the UN commitments on women's rights within criminal justice. I will begin by expressing the imperativeness of bringing human rights and gender perspective when addressing challenges related to drugs and criminal justice. I am confident that conversation like this can help us to navigate and resolve these challenges and to see how UN bodies like CCPCJ and CND can contribute to the actual implementation of gender-sensitive responses that take into consideration women's specific needs and circumstances, and to promote effective access to alternatives to incarceration and state support for women in situations of vulnerability. At the international level, important steps have been taken to incorporate into official debates the relationship between gender-based violence against women, the incarceration of women for drug-related crimes and policies. It is not exaggeration to say that in the last 10 years across UN, a consensus has emerged around the need to adapt criminal justice to specific circumstances of women. These responses should reflect and address women's unique pathway into illegal activities, which are often characterized by poverty, caretaking responsibilities, and in many cases, stories of violence, trauma, and abuse, and should ensure that prison and criminal justice systems do not neglect their needs. Of course, the critical document is the United Nations rules for the treatment of women deprived of liberty, the Bangkok rules, adopted by the UN General Assembly in December 2010, as the first set of international standards on human rights of women deprived of liberty. Amongst many other issues, they emphasize the need to promote and prioritize gender-sensitive alternatives to incarceration for women. The UN bodies based in Vienna have welcomed and reflected the commitments laid down in the Bangkok rules. One recent example being the Kyoto Declaration adopted by the 14th UN Crime Congress in March 2021, in which states endeavor to mainstream a gender perspective into criminal justice system and to promote gender-responsive measures that address the gender-specific needs of people involved with criminal justice system. On the side, different UN entities have been documenting the differential and disproportionate impact of criminal justice on women and have been provided recommendations on how to address it. One of them is notably the new deliberation on women deprived of liberty that has been recently issued by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and that will be presented today by Dr. Miriam Estrada Castillo, member of the working group. This event will undoubtedly allow us to become aware of an issue of great relevance because a considerable number of drug users are women who remain largely invisible. Offenders and prisoners face especially difficult situations when criminal justice systems are not yet ready to meet the specific needs for female drug users. Drug-dependent women are more vulnerable, are more stigmatized than men. They also often bear a heavier burden of drug-related violence and deprivation from their family members. The number of women incarcerated for drug-related crimes is increasing, and the participation of women in drug trade has also increased throughout the world. There are many aspects of drug problems that affect gender equality and therefore development. While there are far more men than women who use drugs, criminal justice responses may not be tailored to the particularities of women in relation to the world drug problem. Yet, and in spite of the political commitments, the reality of women within criminal justice continues to be deeply troubling. According to data compiled by Penal Reform International, in the 10 years following the adoption of the Bangkok rules, the global female prison population increased by 70% to an estimate 741,000, an historical record. From 2000 to 2020, the global female prison population increased by 59%, at more than twice the rate of the male prison population, which rose by 20% between 2000 to 2017. In many regions, this increase has been fueled by the extreme use of pretrial detention and of long prison sentences, and for non-violent drug offenses, including for drug use and possession of substances for personal use. In that regard, evidence shows that women get involved in non-violent drug activities as well as in other petty offenses due to, as mentioned, a combination of poverty, caretaking, responsibilities, and often personal stories of marginalization, violence, and abuse. Promoting constructively effective access to alternatives to incarceration and to state services for women in such situations should be one of our priorities of international bodies. I'm very happy that the CCPCJ thematic discussion, they talked about these issues. Furthermore, in too many occasions, women continue to face a criminal justice system designed by and for men. The reality is that women constitute a small and neglected minority in our prison systems, and that they often lack appropriate gender-sensitive services. Gender-specific elements are rarely taken into consideration in sentencing and in national criminal laws. Combined with the challenges already posed by marginalization, poverty, and lack of resources, this means that women still face disproportionate barriers in accessing legal advice, alternatives to incarceration, and programs and services that meet their specific needs. At the United Nations level, the international community has recognized that violence against women has concrete repercussions for them when they come into contact with criminal justice systems, and also affect the right not to suffer victimization in the event of imprisonment. While physically and psychologically security is decisive to guarantee respect for human rights and improve the situation of criminals. Although gender equality and justice for drug crimes committed by women has not always figured prominently in debates on drugs and crime, specific mentions have been made in some multilateral mechanisms focusing on these issues, such as, firstly, the Bangkok rules for treatment of prisoners and non-deprivation of liberty measures for women offenders, which contains 70 rules specifically addressing the problems and needs of women in prison. In the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, states committed to adopt a multidimensional approach for development and to collaborate in a spirit of common and shared responsibility. Goal number 5 of the 2030 Agenda is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Emphasizing gender equality is a necessary foundation for a peaceful, prosperous, and sustainable world. Resolution 59/5, adopted at the Commission of Narcotic Drugs by initiative of Mexico, recognizes the situation of women and girls involved in the world drug problem and its double facet, as user and or as accused of drug-related crimes, and propose actions such as the application of alternative measures for the deprivation of liberty for pregnant women and mothers accused of minor and non-violent crimes, as well as the inclusion of women, girls, and civil society in the elaboration and implementation of drug policies. Resolution 26/3, adopted by the CCPCJ by initiative of Mexico, urges to incorporate gender perspective in crime prevention and criminal justice policies and programs, as well as preventing and combating transnational organized crime. UNGAS 2016, promoted by Mexico together with Guatemala and Colombia, recognizes the importance of mainstreaming a gender perspective in drug-related programs and policies, both internationally and nationally, as well as the significance of involving women in their design, implementation, and evaluation. And recently, in the Kyoto Declaration, states committed to improving conditions in prisons and incorporating a gender perspective in the criminal justice systems, particularly for the development and application of appropriate and effective policies and plans to achieve gender equality and remove impediments to the advancement of women and the empowerment of women in law enforcement and other criminal justice institutions at all levels. These are, in short, some of the human rights challenges and responses that we will be navigating today. Let me end by saying that in order to address them, we need to listen carefully to the findings and recommendations of UN experts and civil society, but also to the voices of affected communities themselves. Their experiences will also be critical to resolve these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. You provided an excellent overview for launching today's discussion. We'll turn now to Dr. Miriam Estrada Castillo, who joined the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention in 2020 and presently serves as the Vice Chair on Communications. She is a professor of international law, international criminal law and human rights, and director of the UNESCO chair at Casa Grande University of Guayaquil, Ecuador, and she is also a visiting professor at Bard's College. Among other UN positions, Dr. Estrada is a former vice chairperson of the Committee for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, a member of the group which drafted the CEDAW optional protocol. She was also the Latin American Regional Advisor on Gender, Human Rights, and Culture of Peace for UNESCO. In addition to various academic positions, she is a former Minister of Social Affairs and a former president of the National Court for Minors in Ecuador. In July, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention released a landmark report on arbitrary detention and drug policies, which included a strong focus on women. Dr. Estrada, we look forward to hearing more about that from you now.
Excuse me. Good morning for everyone, Excellency, dear colleagues, friends. I am very grateful for this invitation because this is really an important event. It allowed us the so much needed opportunity to further disseminate our study, our deliberation, number 12, and our overall work. I feel privileged not only as a vice chairperson of the working group, I should say, but as you have already said, Coletta, as a former vice chairperson of CEDAW and a member of the group that participated in the draft, the working group procedure body that if we have time in the questions, I would like to elaborate on its procedures and special activities. But just to be sure that I am touching the most important issue, I want you to know that we have quasi-judicial powers through our opinions, jurisprudence, and deliberations. We were determining if people have been arbitrarily detained. In doing so, we examine the case and we give our opinion to the government, calling the government to comply with different specific international conventions, human rights conventions, particularly when it comes to soft law, to the Mandela rules, and to the Bangkok rules. So I want you to be sure that this group of our group is implementing daily in all their opinions the Bangkok rules, taking into account the situation of women in prison facilities. In this occasion, I would like to present briefly for you deliberation number 12 on women deprived of their liberty. We have formulated this deliberation as request of the Human Rights Council, and now we are sharing it with the state parties and civil society, because we need civil society to be aware of these rules so that can be applied and support, and yes, specifically support victims. We are assisting both states and civil society in preventing and addressing cases of arbitrary detention when it comes to women deprived of their liberty. In the deliberation number 12, the working group addresses the gender-specific dimensions of arbitrary detention of women from different perspectives and situations in the criminal justice system. We look at the possibility to access to justice, we look also to the different forms of imprisonment: immigration detention, administrative detention, healthcare situations, and certain private settings. When I am talking about certain private settings, I refer to mental health or special homes where elderly women are placed against their will or need. We are aware that not all women experience deprivation of liberty in the same manner, and it is therefore necessary to consider the unequal and desperate experience of women who already are suffering a patriarchal society, particularly when talking about Latin America, I should say. Multiple levels of discrimination as a product of this special idiosyncrasy. We are deeply concerned, particularly for women who experience these intersecting forms of discrimination, because they are not at risk of arbitrary detention, but because of their sex and gender, but also because of another kind of discrimination linked to a lot of different situations, another kind of factors, which prevents them to properly access to justice on equal foot of dignity or respect, and have the benefit of a due process and fair trial. This is something that we can check on daily basis when we examine the different cases that are presented to our group. We are alarmed by the disproportionate incarceration of women for crimes related to poverty, such as theft, fraud, inability to pay debts, and other offenses related to homelessness and poor living conditions. Particularly now after this pandemic, where women have suffered multiple forms of discrimination on the basis of economic conditions. We are also alarmed, and this is specifically related to this subject, by the numbers of women imprisoned in pre-trial detention, in particularly relation to low-level offenses, and solely by the reason of an inability to post a bail or to pay a fine. This brings us directly to the problem related to drug offenses or policies which affect women and which actually have high rates of imprisonment for drug-related offenses, with approximately 35% of women in prison incarcerated for drug offenses, in comparison to only 19% of male prisoners, with the aggravated situation that women that are imprisoned, incarcerated for drug offenses are kept in pre-trial detention, tortured, raped, and treated in the most terrible forms, as we have also been informed in our cases. Well, the causes of women interaction with the criminal justice system in relation to drug offenses, as we have seen and studied in our cases, are complex and very often linked to other factors, particularly poverty, particularly coercion, particularly gender mentality, idiosyncrasy, and this dependency, economic dependency of women, and the fear that in this vertical relation exists in the gender inequality on a society which is patriarchal essentially. Detention of women in relation, another issue that concerns to us is the detention of women in relation to reproductive health, where the working group remains deeply concerned regarding practices of women that cannot exercise their reproductive rights and that are kept in jail just because they even suffer an abortion, involuntary abortion. In this case, these are women in a prima facie discriminatory situation, and therefore we call governments to change their laws and conduct in order to keep privacy, health, and reproductive rights, and the enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of health.
Dr. Estrada, excuse the
yes.
interruption, but it has been 8 minutes. If you could wrap up, please.
Oh, absolutely. Our deliberation number 12 is really young. It's just 2 months ago that the General Assembly has endorsed it. However, again, my commitment as a vice chairperson of the group and on behalf of the group on arbitrary detention is that we are implementing gender approach to everything related to women, particularly those that are accused for these drug policies that are part of a war that, as we all know, has been already failed and very bad conducted. So thank you very much, and I am ready for any kind of questions you would ask.
Thank you very much for that very clear explanation of the disproportionate impact of drug policies and incarceration on women and their families. I just want to underscore the importance of the working group's report. And we very much appreciate, Dr. Estrada, your efforts to ensure a very strong gender focus, which is clear both in the report and in the deliberation on women and gender. We'll turn now to Gloria Ley, who is the Regional Director for Asia at the International Drug Policy Consortium, a global network of civil society organizations advocating for drug policies grounded in principles of human rights, harm reduction, development, and human security. She is based in Bangkok, Thailand, and leads IDPC's work on gender and drug policy in Asia. Before joining IDPC, Gloria completed a double master's program in public policy that was split between the Central European University, then in Budapest, and the Institute of Social Studies, Erasmus University in The Hague. Prior to that, she worked as a senior policy advisor on law enforcement and drugs and as a lawyer for the Australian government. Before turning it over to you, Gloria, I would just like to remind people that you can put any questions you have in the Q&A. I think we're on track to have about 10 minutes at the end for that. And Gloria, I turn it over to you now.
Thanks, Coletta. While you were introducing, I was trying to bring up the slides so that you wouldn't see the whole screen, but I think you might still see my whole screen. I hope you can see it clearly now, but I know that I don't have a lot of time, so I hope this will be okay, and I'll continue. And actually the main remarks that I'm going to make is really to emphasize and to go into just a bit more detail into the points that have been raised already by Dr. Estrada, Castillo, and by the ambassador as well. We released a paper earlier this year reflecting on the past kind of decade of implementation of the Bangkok rules. And just in general, when you look at the trends of incarceration that have been referred to already, you see very clearly that countries have not been able to implement the commitments they've made in the Bangkok rules in terms of reducing the levels of incarceration. And you see this by just really rapidly increasing rates of incarceration, particularly in Southeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, and in Latin America as well. I'm just going to go into, also kind of highlighting the point made about intersectionality. So just going to reflecting a bit more on the background on the different kind of types of women who are impacted by drug policies and the effects that they have. If we look at women who use drugs, for example, they already face greater levels of stigma and discrimination compared with men who use drugs. You can just think of, people look at women who use drugs differently. And and it's just with a greater level of stigma. And so they face greater levels of discrimination across all aspects of society. And this, of course, affects their ability to access any services that they might need. They also experience greater degrees of violence because they use drugs. And this comes from their family, their partners, and from the criminal justice system. So definitely their interactions with police, and certainly in prisons as well. Dr. Estrada Castillo talked about the vulnerabilities they face in the criminal justice process. And some of the research we've done in Southeast Asia would definitely see this in terms of a lot of the women who are in prison are much less likely to have access to legal advice, legal representation in the processes that led to their imprisonment. If we look at even women who cultivate drugs, so this is an area that is not talked about as often. So just wanted to highlight some of the research that has been done in a project by GIZ and OSF, looking at women who cultivate drugs in Latin America. And you see the different dimensions of poverty that women face, the kind of overall environment of insecurity that they are having to manage. And on top of that, this traditional gender stereotypes that add these kind of layers that they have to deal with. Is exacerbated by, it means that they have an unequal access to opportunities, such as unequal access to land, which then leads on to their also restricted abilities to access economic opportunities and other services. They also have a greater burden that is not paid, for example, in terms of the work that they do in the household and in caring for children, while also engaging in social and political activities as well. And being a woman who is engaged in cultivating drugs, they face multiple layers of burden. Being a woman, being considered a peasant, someone in the rural area, and then bearing also the stigma of having their lives dependent on something that is illegal. I guess this is kind of story about women who engage in the drug supply are a bit more visible, a bit more known. And so stories particularly about the pressure that women face, the coercion that they may face, the threats and intimidation that could result in them agreeing to carry amounts of drugs, particularly across borders or into prisons, that then leads to them being sentenced as a drug trafficker or a drug dealer and spending time in prison. So this is one major pathway for women into prison. And in this case, I also want to highlight that some of the research that is done, that is a lot of the women who are in prison for drug offences are mothers. They are single mothers. And you can see a clear motivation for them engaging in the drug trade is the need to care for children who are dependent on them. And so just to emphasize the multiple layers of kind of stigmatization and discrimination that they face compared with men, because of the kind of vulnerability, the exacerbated vulnerabilities they have to start off with, then leads to them being more likely to be sentenced with disproportionate sentences. The stigma that they get is worse from society because of the expectations that they have to be a good daughter or a good mother. And then when they come out of prison, the barriers that they face to get a job is then even worse because they've already had to deal with these extra layers of stigma and discrimination. I wanted to talk about a global drug policy index. It's the first ever global drug policy index that has been launched in the world. And this just came out in the past week from the harm reduction consortium that the IDPC is part of. And the main purpose of it is to assess national drug policies, to evaluate them according to a broad range of indicators that are in accordance with kind of standards and principles that are outlined in the UN Common Position on Drugs that was released in 2018. So amongst these indicators, it looks at the extent of human rights violations resulting from drug policies. It also looks at the kind of disproportionate impact of drug policies on certain groups, which include women, people of a certain ethnic group, and low income groups. So it looks at the disproportionate impact that leads in terms of the criminal justice system, and as well as the ability to access harm reduction and controlled medicines. I'm just going quickly now because I want to make time for others. So this is the first phase of the index, and it only covers 30 countries. So you see on the different columns here, the kind of 5 major categories in which the drug policies of countries are evaluated in terms of, firstly, whether there's been extreme responses or not, the degree of proportionality in the criminal justice system, the extent of access to harm reduction and access to medicines, and where applicable, measures in relation to development. I think just to highlight, it's clear that when it comes to the impact of criminal justice responses, the extent to which it's disproportionate is obvious, where you see an average score of 29 out of 100 across all 30 countries, and only 4 countries scored over 50 out of 100. And so these low scores show a need for our drug policies to adopt intersectional approaches. And I won't go into the recommendations because my time is up, and I know that Triona is going to focus on recommendations in relation to a gender perspective. So I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria. You were just at 8 minutes. I appreciate that. And I very much look forward to hearing the recommendations that Triona will tell us about. We'll turn now to Parina Subs-Limbu, an activist and founder and executive director of a women-led organization, Dristi, in Kathmandu, Nepal, which seeks to create a stigma and discrimination-free society for female drug users in Nepal and prevent them from contracting HIV/AIDS. Dristi is the first NGO of its kind in that country. Parina has extensive experience working with affected populations, and in particular, women who use drugs and people living with HIV, sex workers, and victims of domestic violence, including physical, sexual, psychological, and economic violence. Her vast on-the-ground experience has given her the tools to assess, recommend, and develop the strategies and support needed to improve the quality of life of women who use drugs and are living with HIV, along with their children. Over the past 13 years, she has planned and led peer-to-peer trainings and has supported network strengthening. She also engages in activism and advocacy to support women who use drugs at the national, regional, and international levels. Parina, I turn it over to you.
I'm looking for the presentation. Hi, there's a presentation, right? Hi, thank you so much, IDPC, for giving me this opportunity. I just want to directly go to the presentation and next. Can you hear me? Okay. So this is all about Dristi Nepal. We were founded in 2006, as she said. So I just want to skip these slides and get into the next slide. Next. Yeah. So talking about women who use drugs, it's no exception here in Nepal as well. It's almost the same what's happening in the world. So if you look at the drug policy here in Nepal, there has been amendment. However, we are still looked as a criminal. There has been slight changes in the policy. However, when we talk about women who use drugs, we have multiple layers of stigma, as my former, they all said about it. It's no exception. Next. So these are the slides that I made, and if you look at the whole survey that has been done in 2019, over 54.5% of women who use drugs have faced arrest, and they are more like, women. When it comes to women, they're very easy. They have been, they're very easy to manipulate. There's been series of violence they've gone through. They've been involved into drug trafficking, and there's been numerous number. If we see also when we see the documents that has been documented in drug trafficking, there are numbers of women who are found to be involved in drug trafficking as well. Next, I think the thing is very quite small. So the effects of drug policy and poverty in WWUD is, although there are lots of issues that has been talked already, and in Nepal, the poverty is something that has affected huge number of women in general. And when it comes to women who use drugs, it's more 100 and 1,000 times more within our community. They've been, raped. They've been into, they're compelled to be in a violence, in a toxic relationship. They often have to go to sentence, So this is not just the policy that has weakened the existence of women who use drugs, but also the poverty that we don't have enough tools or enough support from the government to exercise our rights and to understand the human rights that exist in our country. Next. Yeah, these are the few issues that the society that look at us, we are completely different community here in Nepal. I'm sure this has been in other countries as well. But when we talk about Nepali society, the culture and the stigma is huge. When we talk about drug use, it's only seen within men. But when it comes to women and we start talking about, okay, women who use drugs, they would, look at us like alien, that, okay, so, I've been through so many stigma and I know how it takes to be there and to talk about my own issues that I've been through. And there are lots of women who are not only vulnerable, but also they've been neglected by their family. They are forced to be in detention centers or rehabilitation centers. They are forced not only to, live their life with pity, but also they are forced to be the modern day slavery, the modern day slave in their own family, in the society. So this is not just in the box or in the lens from drug policy. It's all related and interconnected with poverty as well. And we as women in Nepal, we, when we talk about patriarchy, it's very huge. It's very huge. When we talk about the same thing, we are always looked at, we are given names, and there's no way out that we could talk about anything that we are facing as a women who use drugs. So what we have been going through is we don't want to talk about it. And that is one of the major challenges that we are facing since 2006 till this date. We don't see many advocates or many leaders who would actually talk about what they've faced because of the drug policy and the poverty, or they being a person who is using drugs in Nepal. Next. So as I said, the repeated domestic violence cases has arisen, and after COVID-19, it has gone too far. There has been numerous cases that Christi Nepal has been dealing, and then we have been referring. And unfortunately, we don't have one single lawyer who would actually stand for us. When we go through such stigma or such discrimination or such inhuman behavior, there's nowhere we could go and ask for help. Because when we go to some lawyer or for help, they would actually look at us as women who use drugs. And when there's drugs included, they always look at us as criminal, that we lie, we do robbery, we are not real, we are fake. So these are something that we cannot explain to each and every people. Then there should be more awareness, and there has not been specific investment to work on drug policies to address how, as a woman who use drugs, is going through all these challenges in life. Next. So yes, because of all this thing, we face lots of problems coming back to the society, reintegrating back into the society, and often we have to fight for, our own minimal human rights, just to go to the hospital, just to marry, or just to start a new life. It's completely different here. Even if we want to start something new, and if people know that we have been into jail or this thing, they would never let us be even in their job, in their house. There's nothing. So we always have to, unfortunately, we have to lie about our identity. Next.
Pina, excuse the interruption, but you're at 8 minutes. If you could wrap up, please.
Yes, almost. So these are the things that we have found in Dristy, Nepal. We have done a bit of research, and which can be shared. Next. These are our experience, and there are mental health things, issues of our women, and next. Yeah, we're almost done. Yes, so these are the evidences that we have found, and these are the quotes that how our women has been through. Next. These are all the codes that we have reached women who has been into, custody or jail or drug offense, and we have been reaching them out. That's it. And the last one. Done. Next. These all are the evidences. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Not only is it absolutely essential for all of us to be listening to the voices of women who use drugs and women who've been incarcerated, but I also firmly believe that those women who've been directly impacted by these policies should be the ones designing the policy alternatives. So I really appreciate all that you just shared with us, Pina. We'll turn now to our last speaker, and I'll just note we are hitting up against the hour. We will be able to stay for about another 10 minutes to still have the Q&A after this for those of you who are able to stay on a bit longer. Our last speaker will be Triona Lenahan, who is the Policy and International Advocacy Manager at Penal Reform International. She joined PRI in her present position in September 2020, having also worked with PRI in 2013-2014. She leads the implementation of PRI's policy program and advocacy objectives set out in the strategy for 2020-2023, and the development of key resources to support the implementation of international standards. Triona has worked for almost a decade in human rights advocacy, campaigning, and technical assistance, including with the Global Initiative to End All Corporal Punishment of Children and the Irish Penal Reform Trust. She holds a law degree and LLM in international human rights law and public policy from University College Cork, Ireland, and is now based in London, UK. Triona, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Coletta, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's great seeing so many people joined the webinar today and really engaged on this important issue. I think my presentation is going to be shared as well. And I'll get right into it because I know we're short on time. So on the next slide, just to mention that in December of last year, for the 10th anniversary of the UN Bangkok Rules on Women Offenders, PRI conducted some analysis of the figures that are available on the World Prison Brief database, which found that there had been 100,000 more women in prison globally than in 2010. As Ambassador Campuzano mentioned already, this means an increase of 17% in the decade since the Bangkok Rules were adopted. And you can see the significant regional variation on the slide. The overall global prison population has risen by 8% in that same time frame. So this means that the female prison population has increased at twice the rate of the overall global prison population. And we've heard already today how punitive drug policies are a key driver of this increase, particularly in Asia and across Latin America. Also, just to mention that in the context of the pandemic, in many places, women did not benefit from exceptional release measures implemented in response to the pandemic to the same degree as men. So research has found that across 53 jurisdictions, only a quarter of release mechanisms applied criteria to enable the release of women. And also at least 28 countries automatically excluded anyone in prison for drug-related offences from accessing emergency release. We can skip maybe to the fourth slide, we can skip one. So in early last year, PRI and IDPC published a research report. The research was conducted by Linklaters law firm, examining 5 key questions in relation to the sentencing of women for drug-related offences. And this looked at 18 different jurisdictions, the sentencing practices, guidelines and laws. And on the next slide, we just include some of the key findings. It was clear from the analysis that women's complex pathways to involvement in drug-related offences, which were discussed already today, are generally not adequately reflected in legislation or where they exist in sentencing guidelines or practices. There were quite a variety of mitigating factors identified that are prescribed for women in drug-related cases, but the impact of those mitigating factors, when and how they're considered, and the impact on the eventual sentence imposed was far less certain. The impact of mitigating factors was often limited by laws or sentencing guidelines, particularly mandatory minimum sentences, which leave very little discretion for the courts. And also non-custodial sentences were in some places the most common sentence for low-level drug-related offences, in places like Germany and in England and Wales, for example, but in other places they were far less common. So on the next slide, in February last year, we also held an expert meeting in London to discuss the findings of that report and also to gather some further expertise on the issue. And based on the report, as well as the learning from the expert meeting and the paper that Gloria mentioned as well on how punitive drug laws undermine the Bangkok Rules, PRI and IDPC developed this 10-point plan on gender-sensitive drug policies for women. This really just provides some background detail on women in these contexts and relevant international standards and so on, and then sets out a model for reform to support policymakers and criminal justice practitioners to respond more effectively and more positively to help to reduce the really unnecessary imprisonment of women for drug-related offences in line with international standards. So I'll just briefly fire through the 10 points. The first, I mean, a lot of these have already been mentioned today as well, but the first involves removing all the criminal and administrative penalties for offences such as drug use, cultivation, possession of drugs for personal use, and possession of drug use paraphernalia. Only using pretrial detention as a measure of very last resort would mean repealing the many laws and practices that currently exclude people convicted for drug offences from alternatives to imprisonment, and also improving access to quality, free legal representation and support for women to increase their access to diversion measures and also to alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. As we know, many drug laws impose mandatory minimum sentences, which should be removed so that the particular circumstances and backgrounds of the person in question can be taken into account as mitigating circumstances, and particularly including those that are gender specific. So things like the experience of trauma or abuse, coercion, or drug dependence. Fourth, abolishing the death penalty and commuting existing death sentences. But also on this point, I think it's important that life imprisonment doesn't automatically replace the death penalty in either case. Allowing for the systematic consideration of mitigating circumstances in sentencing for drug offences, which would consider both the role of the person in the illegal drug trade, as well as the reasons for their involvement, and also here including gender sensitive mitigating circumstances that really effectively address the main pathways of women's involvement in illegal drug economies. On the last slide, then, we have the final 5 points. So 6 is ensuring that really women charged with non-violent drug offences are eligible for diversionary measures and alternatives to punishment or imprisonment, and that any barriers preventing their access are removed. Adopting a health-based, gender-sensitive approach to drug use and dependence means ensuring women are not criminalized or otherwise punished for using drugs under any circumstances, and that they have access to voluntary drug treatment, harm reduction, and other drug services in the context of diversion measures and alternatives to imprisonment, and that all of those services are evidence-based, gender-sensitive, and trauma-informed. Addressing the special needs of pregnant women and mothers should include things like preferential access to non-custodial measures, and also removing the systematic use of measures like removal of child custody, forced sterilization, or compulsory drug treatment for women who use drugs. Foreign national women detained for drug offences should have access to alternatives to imprisonment, legal counsel, interpretation if they need it, consular assistance, and also the option to be repatriated to their home country. But they should certainly not be automatically deported, particularly those with families in the host country. And finally, a gender responsive training for all professionals involved in the criminal justice process should be provided to promote the understanding of women's drug use and drug dependencies, the key drivers of women's involvement in drug-related offences, international standards, and so on, and also to encourage the use of gender-responsive alternatives to imprisonment. So sorry for flying through it so quickly. There's more detail available in the 10-point plan itself, which I invite you to read, and we'll look forward to some discussion if we have time. Sorry, Coletta, I hope I didn't go over.
No, thank you, Triona, for that excellent presentation, and really getting at the heart of what I'd like to go into more now, which is recommendations for policy reform. We're right at time, but I think I believe our speakers have agreed to stay on for another 10 minutes. So for those of you who can continue with us, we'll go on just a bit longer, and I'm going to lay out some of the questions that have been put into the chat, and one additional question or two additional questions that I would like to raise. I'm going to put all the questions out there at once and then go speaker by speaker to allow you to give very, very brief responses to those questions that are appropriate for you to answer. To begin with, I would like to ask the ambassador from Mexico the following question. You underscored the consensus within the United Nations or at the UN level on the importance of mainstreaming gender into drug policy, as well as the various tools that have come out of the UN for doing so. But we still see a very wide divide between those declarations and tools, and what reforms between those declarations and tools and reforms that have been implemented at the national level. So in your opinion, what more can be done to ensure reforms on the ground? Similarly, I would like to ask Dr. Estrada if you can tell us a bit more about the working group efforts to encourage implementation of the very excellent recommendations in the report that you spoke about today. There is another question for Miriam, which says, for the children below 4 years of age who accompany their mothers to prison, what are some of the best practices to ensure children's rights are not infringed? Being that the prison environment may not be good enough to raise a child. We could have a whole seminar on that. Maybe we should do that. It's a complex issue, but perhaps you could share just a few thoughts on that. And two other questions that I want to bring to the fore are, what are the strategies to be used to get governments to develop drug policies that take a rights-based approach in an environment that is highly stigmatized and criminalized? And more so, how can we promote women-inclusive, women-focused policies? I think I'd like to have you think about that in the context of recommendations and what more can we be doing to encourage policy reforms on the ground. And this is very related to the final question, which is, are there any best practices in the region? So particularly for Triona, Gloria, and Pina, if you have other best practices, and I know, Pina, you had to really run through the last part of your presentation, if there's other issues you can point to that are examples we should be looking at. We have about 10 minutes and there are 5 speakers, so I would ask each of you to keep your responses to 2 or 3 minutes, which I know is going to be very hard. And I'll just go in the same order that we went in before. So I will begin with you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. And first of all, congratulate really for the presentations. I think that these are precisely the kind of things that we can do, to have this kind of events that bring and give visibility to the affected communities, because this is the way how we can really make the point that this has to be really implemented. There's a lot of evidence-based through the work that you've done, and also of civil society that presents this terrible situation and disproportionate actions vis-a-vis women. So the possibility of highlighting how these people have been affected is extremely important. The showcase presented by Pina, it's one of these very, very clear examples of a person that has suffered personally and has dedicated themselves in order to make this visible to the further society. So this is the way how we can try to improve the implementation of all these recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and we really appreciate you taking the time out today in the middle of all of the activity taking place in Vienna to be here with us. Miriam, I turn it over to you now, Dr. Estrada.
Yes, thank you. There are, I believe, several questions for me when it comes to if we have or we had adopted any decision on several cases related to Pakistan. Yes, we had. Not in this particular session, but in previous session, even when I was not a member of the group. That's number one. Number two, to have a child 4 years old imprisoned with the mother is absolutely unacceptable. I haven't seen in the working group so far a case that is requesting something like that, but for juvenile, I mean, for a kid to be there is absolutely unacceptable. However, while writing the Bangkok rules and visiting different prison facilities in the world, this is a social problem. It's an idiosyncratic problem where mothers don't want to leave their children away. Even I remember I have been in Thailand visiting the prison facilities, and there were special rooms for mothers to take care of the little children. However, they were retired from the mother when they were 6 years old. So this is a very difficult issue. Here in my country, it's absolutely impossible to separate mother from children. It's a situation, it's a horrible situation, because we have to be frank and say the things as they are. At least in Ecuador, there is a total divorce of the public policies and the different governments related to prison facilities and people that are in prison. That's a horrible situation. It's not only women, our children, our men, everyone. Right now in this country, police and army forces cannot get into prison facilities as they are being governed by actually the people who are in prison, drug gangs. So the situation is tremendous, it's terrible. And this is what you can see living the situation, as we are living the situation here in the country with assassinations, daily assassinations, and police people unable to get into the prison, army forces unable to get into the prisons, much less trying to retire a child from the mother. So it's a terrible situation, but this absolutely the brutal truth. That's it. I mean, when it comes to my questions, I believe those are all. When it comes to the work of the working group, what is the difference with our working group? We do follow-up, we listen to the two parties, we do a follow-up, and we enact a decision that is also followed up later on. We request from the government to immediately granted freedom to the person that has been put in jail, and we request reparation and also a report from the government. We have a terrible experience with different parts of the world. I look after Latin America is one of the most difficult continents, like to be in jail. That would be like a general answer for the different questions.
Thank you very much. And I would just like to say one thing about the issue of children in prison. We should not be putting mothers of children in prison. We should be using alternatives to incarceration, as is mandated or recommended, I should say, in the Bangkok rules. And also in the United States, we have a very interesting experience now with what are called primary caretakers laws. These have been passed in 3 states, and basically it gives judges the discretion to grant alternatives to incarceration to parents of children or to people who are responsible for caring for people with disabilities or elderly parents. And there are initiatives pending in several other states along those lines as well. Let's see.
Coletta, I'm sorry for the interruption, but there is an element that haven't been touched here. And I believe I should say it and share it, because we haven't talked about corruption. I touched it very lightly when I said women do not have money to pay, but they don't have money to pay not only the bail, but also the bribe that they are requested. So you want to follow the Bangkok rules, pay. Or, you know how it is say here in Ecuador, okay, sex of money, you choose. So it's a horrible situation. Nobody talks about that, but this is reality. So it's terrible, and that's why we are so engaged on pushing governments and civil society that we must claim these rights and we must claim these rules. Thank you. I'm very sorry to interrupt.
No, thank you. That was a very important additional comment there. Gloria?
I think I would just say that to move towards more gender sensitive drug policies, as with like many other problematic areas that need change. I think I just wanted to highlight one is around kind of data to improve understanding of the impacts on women of drug policies in your particular local context. And then secondly, around ensuring around the inclusion of women who are affected by those drug policies in advocating for change. And in terms of best practices, I guess definitely look at Dristi, Nepal, the work that they're doing. It's led by women affected by drug policies, and they're creating and fighting for safe spaces for women to gather, to share their experiences and to work together. And if we're not women affected by drug policies, we can support them in so many ways, whether we're lawyers or researchers or analysts, or able to help provide or source funding for them to be able to do their work, because they face challenges in so many areas, as Pina has outlined. That's it.
Thank you, Gloria. That's a good segue to Pina.
Well, I just saw one thing, one quote there: inability to contribute to the economy. I want to phrase that out. Well, it's not the inability of a woman or women who use drugs. It's the stigma and how patriarchy has ruled the whole world. We need to break the stereotypes. And other than that, with the questions, we're still fighting against the system made by men. The patriarchy that has shadowed the existence of women, and women who use drugs are the most affected one. We are going through hell, and nobody would actually look at us and would try to help us. We are not asking for violence. We are not asking for anything that is inhuman just because we use drugs. That has to be cut off from everywhere, you know? And there is the existence of the women has already been so stigmatized that the stereotypes that exist in our society, and they portray us as a bad and a good woman. So we, as a women who use drugs, we are bad women. Not only that, we are being called out as a bad mother, which is not true. Absolutely, this is not true. I have a beautiful son, and I'm doing it right. So there's nothing to do with what we use or what we don't use. So, you know, this is all the thing that we have to go all the way along. And then this type of webinar has to be there. We have to come together. We cannot do anything by ourselves. We have to continue fighting against every odds. So it's not just when it comes to women who use drugs, it's not just the policy that exists in our country. It's the whole social, economy, cultural. These all things are affecting us, and we have to break this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing those very important messages with us. Now I will turn to Triona for the last set of comments.
Thanks, Coletta, and to everyone for all of your additional comments. Yeah, I think just following up on the best practices, we at the moment have been updating our guidance document. PRI has a fairly comprehensive guidance document on implementing the Bangkok rules, which was published back in 2013. And we've been updating that, and we'll be launching the second edition next month at the anniversary of the Bangkok Rules around the 20th of December. And as part of that, we've kind of been reflecting on a lot of the practices and information around implementation that was shared around the 10th anniversary last year, and you know, in all of these type of events, and hearing from all these wonderful speakers doing great work in the various countries. So we've seen some examples for, you know, example of like rehabilitation programs, even within prisons, that are providing sort of wraparound services or like multidisciplinary case management that looks at, you know, health, physical health, mental health, and also harm reduction and drug treatment services. So there'll be some interesting examples included in the guidance document, but also we will launch alongside that an interactive map on our website, which will include a lot more examples of implementation from around the world that didn't make it into the actual document. So we will invite you to well, to share that when it's published next month, and also then to send any contributions. You know, if anyone has any program they want to highlight, would be very happy to hear more about it and to include it so that people can more easily find it and hopefully, you know, replicate a lot of the positive examples around the world.
Thank you very much. I hate to close this absolutely wonderful event, but we're 15 minutes over time. I very much appreciate all of you in the audience who've been able to stay on as long as you have, and for your very positive comments and feedback in the chat. We very much appreciate it. And I would particularly like to thank all of our speakers for taking the time out of their day to be with us and to share their thoughts, ideas, and recommendations here with us today. As was noted in the chat, we will be posting this recording and encourage you to share it with others. And at that, I would just like to say goodbye and thanks to everybody for joining us here today.